You are not going to believe how the state and big tech are introducing emergency powers to control your life. In this conversation that I had with Luke Kemp, who's an existential crisis researcher at Cambridge University, we talked about the problems that ensue from an increase in surveillance, mandate, and control, and how it's happening globally. You're going to love this conversation. If you want to see all of it, check out my podcast, Under the Skin. You can get it from Luminary, which is available on Apple anywhere around the world, and you can directly download it on other phones, elsewhere too. In this conversation between Luke and I, we discuss how the system is exhibiting not bugs, but features when it takes our data and controls us. Stay to the very end because I want your comments and I want your opinion.
There's a lot of rich things to discuss here, but what I want to hone in on is this idea that the system is working as it's intended. And I think that isn't just appropriate for capitalism, but it's also appropriate in many ways for the use of emergency powers and the way that they tend to operate in terms of reinforcing a hierarchy and trying to often expand the scope of governmental powers and capacities, usually in very particular directions. So one thing I discussed in the article is that when it comes to crises and our responses to them, we disproportionately favor surveillance measures. So whether it's terrorism or microbes, we often first will want to go towards anything that involves surveillance, even when we actually don't have good evidence that mass surveillance is going to help with either one of these. When it comes to the NSA's programs, when they were actually pushed in court to justify why they had, basically overstepped the line towards mass surveillance of metadata, they, I think, came up with initially, around about 50 cases as to why they felt this was helpful in catching a terrorist. When they got pushed further, they could only cite one. And that, I believe, was a case where basically they caught a Somali taxi driver who was transferring something infinitesimally small, like $5,000 to a terrorist group. And even in that case, it's unclear as to whether the actual large mass surveillance program of the NSA was really decisive in ensuring that person was captured. So in short, we don't have good evidence that these things work, but the reason we go towards surveillance is because that's what states want to do. There's this very typical and beautiful book by James C. Scott, a political scientist and anthropologist at Yale. He talks about seeing like a state, that states want to make both their territories and their citizens legible, which is why we've seen things like the imposition of surnames, for instance, so you can basically trace someone's lineage and ensure they're appropriately taxed. Also saw, the introduction of common measurements, so you could make sure that taxation was once again more efficient. In China, you had the introduction of certain maps which would measure the fertility of different soils to ensure your taxation system was most effective as possible. And of course, in the modern world, we have big data. But it's all basically about making sure that you understand your citizens as acutely as possible so you can, in essence, control them.
Yeah.
One of Scott's key arguments is, this is not a bug, it's a feature. This is exactly how states want to see the world. And I think that's not just true for states. I do think this is true for most hierarchies. They have a particular way they want to see the world. And, platforms, whether it's Google or Facebook, the way they try to view the world is almost identical to a state. And emergency powers are usually about extending the apparatus by which the state can see, but also by which it can operate and act. And I think similarly, emergency powers in general, the purpose of them is in part conservative. They're supposed to protect the existing constitution and kind of authority structures, but they're also supposed to extend powers as well. And they do both of those things quite effectively. But again, I think the despotic drift in many ways, there's ways of framing this in which it's, again, a feature, not a bug. Yes, it is supposed to protect the Constitution. One could argue that despotic drift is a kind of distortion of that.
The point of a system of governance, or perhaps actually, perhaps any system, is control and management. And this term you use, despotic drift, I suppose suggests that a system, once control has been established, if control can ever really be established, the tendency is, an inclination is to increase the control, to increase efficacy. Is it therefore, do you think, Luke, necessary, if you are to countenance this tendency, to propose and even maybe impose decentralization, because any centralized system is ultimately going to suffer from that tendency and thus accumulate eventually more power. And the only way to moderate that meaningfully is to ensure there are numerous centers, that there is that you can't have, as we have currently, a kind of corporate state interlocking systems that continually support, sustain, and evolve one another. That essentially now the problem is too much centralization. Whatever aesthetic inflection it bears, state corporatism, the kind of state capitalism of China, or whatever it is we have now in the kind of countries that we're broadly discussing.
Yeah, I think decentralization is key, and alongside that is what I like to call leveling. So leveling of certain power structures and systems. So in the book, The Source of Social Power by Michael Mann, which is kind of this like classic of sociology, he talks about 4 sources of power: ideological, economic, military, and political. And I think what you were talking about before, Russell, this idea that even if you have deliberative democracy, there'll be automatic responses that will attempt to co-opt it. I think that's probably true. And I think the key thing there is that if you have any massive centralization in one of these particular forms of power, it'll eventually spill over into the others. So even if we do kind of level power by having sortition and deliberative democracy, and we kind of level political power, if you still have billionaires and you still have massive wealth inequalities, they'll find ways of distorting the political process, even if it's deliberative. And to me, this is the kind of the great challenge of our time in a way. It's not just simply about trying to fix politics. It's also about trying to fix each of these sources of social power to try to level them. And that is much easier said rather than done.
Yeah, it is. I suppose the first thing you have to do is isolate what the sources of this power is. There are economic and financial sources. There are sort of institutionalized power sources, both in the private sector and in government. And the relationships between them, of course, is what keeps the machine kind of rolling. I can see sort of how many of the ideas that we've already touched upon, in addition to sort of breaking down some of these relationships, would be powerful. But perhaps before we try to dismantle global capitalism, let's return for a moment to these emergency powers and the inception of our conversation. Because loads of people, by the way, like sort of said, what is this article that you're using? When like we did a video around your article. And like lots of people were very interested in the source material, which is you're the source material, and by God, what a source it is! So, so what I recommend, people that work for me are sort of laughing at my flirting. I'm married in that, by the way, so incidentally, I'm sure you don't feel particular, just to let you know. My point is. Well, what did you think about that video from my podcast, Under the Skin? If you really enjoyed it, perhaps you'll consider going over to Luminary and subscribing. But I'd love to know what you think about it in the comments below. Give us a like, subscribe to this channel. If you enjoyed this video, why not have a look at this one or this one? And please subscribe to my newsletter, just one click away, so we can remain in continual contact. Stay free.